Today, we're going to talk about what caused the American Revolution, not the battles, not the Declaration, but the big picture. Why did 13 backwater colonies on the edge of civilization decide to poke the biggest empire in the world right in the eye? Spoiler alert, it wasn't just about taxes, and no, it wasn't because they hated tea, though I must admit, I'm more of a coffee man myself, a free coffee man. Now, I want you to imagine a situation. Imagine you've got a landlord. At first, he leaves you alone. You fix your own plumbing, grow your own vegetables, maybe build a nice porch. You even fight off a few burglars on your own dime. Then one day, after decades of benign neglect, he strolls in and says, "Nice house. I'll be taking half your income now. Also, no more porch renovations unless I say so." That, students, is how many colonists began to feel about the British Crown. Let's break it down into 5 key causes. Key. 1. The legacy of salutary neglect. For most of the 17th and early 18th century, Britain basically left the colonies alone. This period was so hands-off, we historians call it salutary neglect. That's a fancy way of saying, we'll ignore you if you behave. And behave we did. Well, mostly. Colonists ran their own legislatures, taxed themselves, and defended their own frontiers. For a long time, they thought of themselves as British. Yes, but also as a different breed of Britons. Tougher, freer, more self-reliant. So, when the British government tried to tighten the screws after the French and Indian War, it was like telling a 40-year-old man that his mother would now be picking his clothes again. He's going to say, "Excuse me, I've been dressing myself since the 1720s. 2. The French and Indian War and the cost of empire. The French and Indian War, 1754 to 1763, was the colonial chapter of the global 7 Years' War. Britain won, huzzah, but came out of it broke, absolutely broke, like college student eating instant noodles broke. So what did they do? They looked around for ways to pay off the debt. And there, across the Atlantic, were those prosperous colonies, wealthy merchants, booming farms, and not a single member of parliament to represent them. Perfect. Enter taxes, which brings us to the third. No taxation without representation, but not just that. Now, most of you have heard this slogan, no taxation without representation. It's catchy, it rhymes, and it fits nicely on a protest sign. Point. But let's be clear, the colonists weren't against all taxes. They were against being taxed by a parliament in which they had no say. It wasn't about money, it was about power, about who gets to decide. First came the Sugar Act, 1764, then the Stamp Act, 1765, a tax on paper of all things. You couldn't even get married without paying a fee for the certificate. Weddings, expensive even in the 1760s. Colonists protested, boycotted, and in some places they rioted. Britain repealed the Stamp Act, but then passed the Declaratory Act, essentially saying, okay, fine, no stamps, but we can still do whatever we want to you. Nice try. Fourth, British arrogance and colonial identity. Let me put this gently. The British ruling class didn't exactly respect the colonists. Many British elites saw Americans as backwoods cousins, ill-dressed, ill-mannered, and dangerously independent. And to be fair, many colonists were all of those things, but they were also deeply committed to liberty, self-government, and yes, their rights as Englishmen. When the British started sending troops to enforce order, peacetime troops stationed in American cities, it looked suspicious. Colonists didn't see soldiers, they saw occupiers. And when British soldiers fired on a mob of angry Bostonians in 1770, we got the Boston Massacre, an event more spun than a DC press conference. Add to that the Quartering Act, which allowed soldiers to be housed in colonists' homes. Imagine being told to let a man in red with a musket bunk in your guest room, and you've got tension on a slow boil. 5. The Intolerable Acts and the Point of No Return. Fast forward to 1773. A bunch of colonists dressed up like Mohawks, cultural appropriation and treason, a 2-for-1, and dumped 342 chests of tea into Boston Harbor. This was not a prank. This was a message. Britain responded with the coercive acts, which the colonists called the Intolerable Acts, because frankly, slightly annoying acts didn't have the same ring to it. They shut down Boston's port, dissolved local government, and sent more troops. That's like your landlord changing the locks on your front door and charging you a late fee for complaining. The result? Colonists who once hoped to fix the system, like John Adams, now started thinking about leaving it altogether. The First Continental Congress was called, the colonies began organizing militias, and by the time shots were fired at Lexington and Concord in 1775, the fuse had burned down. So, what was it all about? At its core, the American Revolution was about self-government. The colonists believed they had the right to govern themselves, and the British believed they had the right to govern the colonies. That's the tension. It wasn't radicalism that drove the founders, it was conservatism. They wanted to conserve their liberties, to preserve the English constitutional tradition they believed the king and parliament had abandoned. They didn't want revolution, they wanted rights. It's just that George III, God bless him, was too stubborn to see it. What can we learn from this? You might think this is all ancient history. The founders were cautious, thoughtful men. They didn't act in haste. They sent petitions. They debated. They tried to reconcile. When that failed, they declared independence, not gleefully, but reluctantly, and at great personal cost. So the next time someone tells you the revolution was just a bunch of spoiled colonists whining about taxes, remember this. They fought a war not to remake society, but to reclaim it. Not to overthrow the idea of order, but to restore it. That's a conservative revolution, if there ever was one, and they won. So let's raise a metaphorical glass to liberty, to self-government, and to those brave enough to say, no thanks, we'll do it ourselves. Thank you.